Introduce Ciaran. So, Ciaran's done a lot of things. He's a composer, musician, media artist, researcher, currently based in Melbourne, currently doing a PhD in the Sensor Lab at Monash. So he's previously undertaken a composition residence in the Arctic Circle, which involves sonification of Arctic lichen. He created a botanical sonification toolbox for sonifying plant life. He's got a strong interest in sustainability, worked with Fergus Dixon to create the minimal but highly capable Midge synthesizer. But perhaps most relevant to today's theme, his research and practice focuses on meaningful music creation regardless of musical experience, which definitely hit a mark for me. So over to you, Ciaran.
Thank you so much, Simon. I will attempt to share my screen. Let's see how this goes. So I share that, and then I'll go like that. And how's that? Is that a little better? Is that like a full screen? Great. Amazing. Great. Thanks so much to Tom and Simon for this opportunity to talk. I thought I'd talk a little bit about a specific project today. The title is Made to Measure Mapping, so you'll probably see why in a few minutes. But yeah, basically I'd love to cover just really briefly some trends in instrument design and digital musical instrument design. I'll talk a little bit about the most recent project I've worked on, which is called the Boilover Project. And then I'll maybe try to kind of cap it off with some thoughts on where we're kind of contributing to the area of digital musical instruments. But first, I guess just to talk about two trends that I'm kind of not bothering me, but I'm kind of pondering a lot recently in instrument design. The first is replicability. So the ability to kind of recreate these instruments and experiences across software and time and borders and all sorts of things like that. And obviously, replicability is very important in the instrument community because we need to verify and validate results. We need to check something's true if I claim it is. And also, I guess if something is replicable, it means it can be used by more people across more generations, across different geographical regions, which I guess is a form of accessibility as well. So that's an interesting proposition. And obviously there's always the much heard provocation of a once interesting but now unplayable interface. And I'm sure we can probably all think of countless examples of instruments that fit that category. The second theme that I'm interested in at the moment is this idea of this kind of drifting towards this kind of generalized instrument. And I think the majority of instruments in, especially in the NIME community, are often presented with one or maybe a few mapping possibilities. I think the Mimu gloves are an exception to that rule. I think they're often presented with a sort of very wide range of possibilities. But generally, I think lots of instruments, they tend to kind of gravitate around a certain mapping or a certain affordance, I guess we could say. And I guess my question is, are these the outcomes that we want for an accessible instrument? Because if we look at what is kind of happening with these trends, I question whether we are actually creating something that is similar to an acoustic instrument. And I would like to question whether that does enable us to produce an instrument that helps individuals realize their own ideas about music performance and music composition and things like that. I think one of the great powers, obviously, of digital musical instruments is that they can be made accessible quite a lot easier than, say, a violin or a piano might be able to. And Alon Ilsar and Emma Fried have talked a lot about this, the idea that it's actually not such a large reach to create a potentially accessible experience for someone. And this isn't a negative comment. I guess it's more an observation or maybe an opportunity. I'm not criticizing the violin or the piano. There's, we couldn't ever have an instrument that does every single mapping and at every single, possibility ever. But these are just kind of questions that I'm considering at the moment. And of course, it's very relevant to the work that I do because, as you can tell, I work a lot on digital musical instruments. And at the moment, I am working on the AirSticks project. So the AirSticks are a DMI that were developed by Alon Ilsa, who I work with at Sensor Lab at Monash. And they are basically a sort of a relative position sensor. They use a IMU, so they know their orientation and acceleration. And we've used Bluetooth to communicate through a low latency connection to custom software. We can map all sorts of things. We've actually just created a new AirStick. It's more like an AirBox at the moment. It's just a little kind of tiny box. And I'd like to take you through one of the examples of the projects that we've used this in, maybe unpack a few things about that project. So the Boilover project, Boilover, the ensemble, is an inclusive theatre ensemble. They're a neurodiverse collection of artists with disabilities. And I guess from the outset, it's quite important to note that this isn't a health program or a therapy program. These are practicing artists making art with, I loved the term before, an art with a capital A. These are all practicing artists. They're a theatre group, and they do a lot of work in physical theatre and movement. And so our team at Sensor Lab was approached by Boilover last year. It was a very informal invitation at first. They sort of just said, do you want to come along and try some things out? We said, great. So once a fortnight, we would go out to the community hall with all our gear. They would show us some things. We'd try some things. It was a great little time to experiment. But as we kind of came along every fortnight, it kind of segued into working alongside Boilover on a production that they had coming up. And the production was called Boy. And it was basically an ocean-themed kind of theatre and physical movement experience. And our aim as musicians was to essentially enhance the physical elements of the production that the artists had come up with. And we did that through a bunch of workshops. So we started these workshops, and of course, there's many possible approaches. I guess the most obvious one would be, let's make an instrument that fits, everyone in the ensemble. And maybe it triggers different sounds, maybe it triggers different mappings. But I guess we very quickly discovered that obviously everyone has completely different needs in the ensemble. We had all these amazing artists with extremely diverse skills, so different physical preferences, different listening preferences, different ways of moving. So instead of making one instrument out of these AirSticks or using one particular mapping, we basically made 10. And these, I guess it's important to note that these aren't just different mappings. They were completely different. I guess you could really say they were completely different instruments that were specifically tailored to each of these artists, designed from essentially the ground up each time. So we used the AirSticks as a starting point. We used the data coming from that. But apart from that, we would basically rewrite and kind of design the instrument all the way down to, where does it sit on the body? Does it sit on the body? Does it sit on a rope? What's the sound world? What is the, physical kind of experience of the AirStick and the performer? So all these kind of things mushed together. And I'll just play a little sample. I won't play it for too long. It's probably quite a long video, but I'll just show you a little sample of what that looked like. user of the show. As you can see, there's actually, you never really see the AirSticks. So what we did is we kind of embedded them in costumes and on props. You might have noticed there's a couple of shells there. So we put them inside a bunch of shells, kind of embedded them in all sorts of locations. But I guess it's very important to note that each of these performers had their own AirStick, you could say, and their own completely different instrument. And I think probably the best and most important part of the production was the individuality of these artists and their neurodiversity and their movements, and their ideas that they each brought to the stage in creating these instruments. So I'd like to talk just a little bit about how we created what we're calling these hyper-bespoke instruments. I think probably the best way to do that is through a little example. So Connor was one of the performers, and I'll just talk very quickly about how Connor took us through the process of what he wanted and what we created. But I guess I'm using the term breakthroughs because these aren't solutions. It's not like, oh, well, we do these things and yeah, great, and now everything's accessible. These are just sort of our learnings from this process. It's not a recipe book to accessibility, I guess. So this is Connor on the left here. So we had a lot of aerials in this show. And Connor arrived quite late in the process of the show, which allowed us to kind of really carefully document what we were doing after we prepared a bunch of other instruments. So the first thing we really focused on was listening preferences, so music listening preferences. This one emerged really organically. Actually, one of the first sessions, I remember we went around in a circle and we talked about, different genres of music that we each listened to. It always sounds really obvious when you say it out loud, but, often we don't tend to talk about, what does everyone listen to? What are you interested in hearing, and what kind of things might you want to play? I find that question isn't asked as much as you would think. And so Connor arrived and he actually gave us a bunch of YouTube links. And he said, this is what I basically have been using to move to. Like, can we enhance this? And it's a little bit blurry, but one of the YouTube links was this kind of seaside, kind of synth, relaxing music. And we said, great, fantastic, we can take that and run with that. So the next thing we did, and I guess the next kind of big breakthrough we had was gesture recording and playback. So we would spend sort of 3 or 4 hours each fortnight with the performers. And that was great because we could workshop all sorts of things, tweak things. But where we really found we could kind of really dig in was we would record what was happening in each of these sessions and record what was coming out of these AirSticks. That meant we could focus on, feedback and really kind of quick, easy fixes in the rehearsal. And then we could go home and we could actually just sit and replay what was happening in these rehearsals. It was almost like, in fact, in our software, it is literally like someone is using the AirStick, as if they were plugged in. It's such a simple little feature, but it was meant that we could go home and, spend an extra 4 hours and say, okay, hang on, what's actually going on with this movement? So in Connor's case, Connor was up in aerials on this rope. And so we decided, let's put the AirStick on the rope and see what happens. In a rehearsal, we were not entirely convinced. We thought, well, it's making us sound, but it's not really what Connor's looking for, and it's not really effective. And then we could go home and say, oh no, actually, it just wasn't mapped to the right variable. If we look really closely, we can see, for example, we can see the rope spinning within this variable. So in this case, I think that blurry graph there was literally just the pitch angle. So we could very clearly see the rope spinning. So next time we came back, we said to Connor, here's an example of a new mapping. If you want to try it, let's see if it works. Because we've kind of played with it at home. Let's see if it works in real life. And that just allowed us that kind of really iterative process of feedback and taking it back to the studio, back to the rehearsal, back to the studio. It's a really fruitful process we found. And then the final aspect that we really played with was this idea of precomposition. I guess this isn't really, it's not making things simpler. If anything, the music is often much more complex and the interaction is less obvious when we tended to, write out sort of more lengthy lines. I know Claire mentioned before, often these things aren't easier. They might seem like you're trying to create an easy experience, but this isn't a matter of ease. In fact, what we found it was really good for was taking these listening preferences and saying, okay, well, there's, let's unpack this listening, this YouTube clip that you've listened to, for example. Let's pull out the synth line. Why don't we take that synth line in its entirety and you control, the cutoff or the decay or things like that? It's still expressive. It's not at all kind of dumbing things down or making it simpler. But it's retaining that kind of original spark or that original kind of musical idea. And we found it really, we could use it to great effect beyond just sort of generating a MIDI information or control values. We could actually use these clips and perhaps reveal them through, energy or, all sorts of variables. And so in the case of that previous variable, with kind of swinging on the rope, we essentially mapped it to trigger an additional synth sound when more dramatic swaying was detected. But of course, these lines, these synth triggers were pre-composed, but the piece that Connor was performing was always heard for the first time when Connor was performing it uniquely each time. And that all kind of culminated. I'm just going to play a little short example of Connor in the actual performance, of what that looked like. So the AirSticks on that rope. So, yeah, I guess that was one example of 10. I think to go back to that original provocation about a once interesting but now unplayable interface, I guess I'd really like to finish with another provocation. Perhaps what we're creating is once meaningful and forever unplayable interfaces. These instruments that we've created in collaboration with these artists may never be played again. They are not designed to be played by anyone but these performers, and they were made for this production alone. In fact, they would almost have no meaning at all if anyone else was to pick up these, AirSticks with this particular mapping and try them out. And so, yeah, perhaps there's something in the resistance to, perhaps there's nothing so sinister about a once interesting but now unplayable interface. Maybe we should be embracing these forever unplayable interfaces as something to celebrate instead. Yeah, thank you so much. I'd love to keep chatting and yeah.
Can I jump in, Ciaran? That's like really fascinating. I just asked if I could jump in and then jumped in. I wasn't.
Please, no.
I could talk to you about this stuff for days. I think there's so much stuff interesting. I would really like to get in touch with you and just chat a bit more if that's cool with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
You on the internet, I'm sure. But you sort of amplified a point that I've been thinking about a little bit with the gloves. Is I've started to think, are the gloves the instrument, or is the mapping the instrument? Because it's a blank canvas, and what you're talking about is that the mapping, the engagement with it, not everyone is going to like air drum or do the invisible violin thing or whatever. So almost the glove, people talk about the Mimi gloves as an instrument, but are they maybe a platform, and maybe the mapping itself is the instrument? And it's really interesting to hear that echoed with your work with the AirSticks, because that's really what you're embracing, that the performers that you're working with they're engaging with the same piece of hardware. I'm not really asking a question here, I'm just repeating what you said, but they're engaging with the same piece of hardware and using it in completely different expressive ways. And there's a lot to be said about what you're saying, that maybe we should just embrace that it's not meant to be a solution forever. It's in the space that it exists in. For the time.
Let me just slip a very quick one in. That's really chiming here, but I'm wondering, are the hands the instrument? You know, is it not in fact the mapping, but the hands? Sorry, just a quick one there.
Further provocations. There's
yeah. I think it's so interesting. Like because it's even so weird to talk about. Like, you know, obviously we have this project called the AirSticks, and like everyone works on it, but then actually, you know, most of the work and the kind of the things that we're really interested in might never involve the same, you know, thing, like you say. So it's almost like, I mean, I guess the T-Sticks have talked about this a little bit, but there's that idea of like maybe the AirSticks, or the, you know, insert name of instrument here is more the, you know, collection of people around that technology, or the community, or the culture, or the mappings, or I think it's such a fascinating.
Can I just jump in as well? I think what it chimes for me is this, you know, the idea of unconscious bias, and that's quite a common thing, and people don't realize. I think I'm totally good. I would define myself as an able-bodied person, and I think at various times I'm guilty of unconscious ableism, where there's a presumption that what you're trying to do is create a thing. And often what you're doing, you start at the wrong point of the journey. So this idea of, instruments are really important. You know, violin is an instrument, and that's how people make music. Therefore, we need to replicate that. Rather than beginning with, human beings didn't discover music as this thing. Music is something that comes out of us, and we have discovered over eons ways of controlling sounds. And so even Simon, you know, the hand is, I mean, if you have no hands, then can you not be a musician? And the idea of any way of controlling a sound and people recognizing that you meant it is kind of the beginning point of making music. And an instrument is part of the tool. But also, you know, what about the sound libraries and the sample libraries that we're using, and the manipulation we have with those, the complexity with the actual point at which it touches your body, or that your body, you know, the movement is captured. And there's all these stages. And again, it's this idea of it is much more of a jigsaw than a kind of a single thing. Me and Ali have kind of joked before about, we have this sort of paradox in the work we do. Is what we're trying to do is create a universal bespoke instrument. Suits everybody, but suits an individual entirely. Right. Hi, Ali. There's Ali over there. But yes, it's this kind of, it's almost a paradoxical thing we're trying to do, is make something very specialized. And actually, Ciaran, what you said at the end there about perhaps the idea, and it's like, who told you that you had to make an instrument that will then exist for all time and be of equal value as the violin? And maybe that's not the goal. It is for that individual to be experiencing control of sound and explore that world. Really great. I'm going to shut up.
Kind of an interesting thing, actually, that lots of instruments were fleeting in history, and they came and they went, and you know, few people are currently taking up the crumhorn and the serpent and things, and we got to this moment where we suddenly decided these things that exist right now, these are instruments, and I never quite understood why that was the moment in time that we fixated on, that these have become the instruments, and an orchestra now looks like this and it's got these in it, and what I was sort of writing down as we were going along was, I love the idea of something that has this replicable central core that can move forward, because we do see a lot of tech that comes and goes. Somebody has a project to produce a thing, and then something happens to the security of a library that they were working on, and then it dies a death. It can't be continued, or the development support doesn't continue. When it is one instrument that is being developed for one person, it gets as far as a few years and some exciting press, and then it ceases to be a thing. And I love the idea of something that has that more durable central core. And the other thing that I was thinking of was it being something, because of that durability, and perhaps a simplicity at the centre of it, that it's something that somebody can more easily take home and practice, and they don't need loads of specialist setup in their home or in their school and whatever, because if you get these very complicated pieces of tech, they're great, but if somebody's support comes and goes and comes and goes, and you keep getting a new person, and then you've got to do all this setup all over again. This is how you get this working. So something that's much more customized to one person, but yet also has a central online library where somebody can hop on Google and find out what to do with something. It's really appealing to me.
We just need to make Ali in robot form, and then you can come round with us
Just to
and
sort of
set up our
outline it,
tech.
yeah. Just download you.
Be the first robot.
Yeah.
Set up our tech and program our stuff.
I suppose, yeah, that's the. I just echo what Claire says about having gone in and done lots of school projects with lots of accessible tech. It is so reliant on the teacher or the support, A, engaging in the first place, and B, then being the same next time. So the prospect of building things is really reliant on continuing to work with people who've had a little bit of exposure, then a little bit more exposure, and it's just not guaranteed. So you feel like you start from scratch quite a lot. But maybe that's the way it is. But yeah.
Because that was quite interesting as an idea, that maybe the instrument and the whole thing does just exist in that space, and then it's gone, because that is an experience that we've had over and over again, that something does just poof up into smoke, and we're tending to see that always as a negative, but maybe it doesn't need to be. That with my teacher brain on, I was looking at that in terms of, it's really nice to have an instrument that you can do some teaching with, and you can figure out, because when I look at how I'm going to teach X number of people how to play an iPad on Thumb Jam, I can't go down to the music store and get out the book of techniques. It's not out there. We've got to write everything from scratch. How do you play this? How do you notate it? What is the progression? What is a simple or an advanced piece of technique? And what are those things called, so that you have a common library of vocabulary to speak to each other about what you're doing?
Can I just quickly jump in as building on that as well, Claire? I think that's a really important point. The other thing I would say is that a lot of the things that we value in traditional instruments are to do with speed, durability of human sort of energy, also pushing the physical aspects of playing the instruments to the very limit. And I think that there's a very small population of humans who have supportive parents, the right background, genetic kind of luck to be able to achieve that kind of high level of high, in not my word, level of musicianship. And we do quite a lot of work with conservatoires and with sort of professional arts organisations. And I don't think it's unfair to say that most of the musicians who are training in the conservatoire are aware they're not going to be good enough to do this professionally, and that feels bad. Most of the musicians who do get good enough, do it professionally, then spend the rest of their career wrestling with whether they should have done, whether they're happy, all of these things. And it's that. So the world of music actually has an awful lot to learn from this different way of thinking about instruments and about why people would want to make music. In that, I think a lot of people are making music very unhappily, but very well according to somebody's definition of what is great music. And it's this is where the work that we're doing is so important, because actually we're having to think about it in a slightly different way. But then if you say to people, hey, we've discovered this way of doing it, and actually it feels really good, and the music's really interesting, it's actually involved all kinds of different levels of ability, different levels of experience, different types of physical movement, why don't you try it, everyone else? And that's kind of, that this sort of turning it around. So that's, I suppose, my big point, this idea of, we're not trying to draw people out of a world that they want to be in this kind of thing. It's about turning the whole thing on its head and saying, actually, the best inclusive education, the best inclusive arts, the best inclusive forms actually should then inform the old stuff, the museum stuff, the traditional, the conventional, because actually it's not that great what's happening.
And actually, to take your point even further, bounce off your point again, even on the other side, I think, so we've got, this idea of the genius and the peak kind of performance and all that on that spectrum, and all the way down the other end, I find it really interesting. We've got these projects striving for, music for everyone, performance for everyone. And what I find really interesting is that I don't know who everyone is. Like, is there one instrument that everyone can play, or is there one instrument that everyone should play? Whereas I think what's more interesting, I think also what you're referring to, is this idea of, well, what about individuals' ideas of music making? And how can we facilitate that? Maybe that is a form of everyone, but I feel like the term everyone is used very frequently without much thought given to what that might mean.
Can I very briefly and probably completely incoherently try to bounce off this? So first of all, this morning's discussion has completely, it's really given me a new perspective. So key things for me were the inclusion, the jigsaw, but okay, so the formative experience in my life was working for an organization where the axiom was everyone is an artist, okay? And that did transform various people's lives. And it was an illumination for me to hear that Drake, well, with what Chris was saying, with what everyone was saying, was that the goal can simply be, I'm a friggin' artist, I'm a musician, I mean it seriously, full stop, just whatever we need to do to get that to work. So, but that was a big illumination. But one of the things we did at this place I worked way back in the day in Liverpool, as it happened, well, we had school kids who were truants and being thrown out of school, desperate to get into this place, but we only some of the time was art. The rest of the time we had to do other stuff. But one of the things we did was we put on public events where there was one at the Walker Art Gallery, the Rembrandt game, where the public had to come in and the public each had to make a picture. But we were saying, oh no, this is nothing about expressing yourself. We're going to do various tests on you, on your body as it happened, on the symmetry of your body. And we want whatever you draw to communicate this unambiguously. So for that particular game, we weren't focused on expression. What am I trying to get at? I guess what I'm trying to get at is I've understood from the discussion today the importance of the idea of, in many cases, this person is an artist. That's what they want to do. It's however you assemble the jigsaw for that to happen. But thinking about Ciaran's thing, I mean, not everybody wants to be a musician. People want to be other kinds of, people want to be theatre artists. People want to be movement artists. And I'm sort of trying to think of the spectrum of how, on the one hand, you get the jigsaw so people can do what they mean, but whether there are useful contributions for music for people with disabilities where that's not there. So I'm just thinking, I don't know, I'm just thinking.
What do people think about because I peer over the fence once in a while in terms of other opportunities for disabled people. Like I have delusions of sporting success. I play wheelchair basketball, for example, and I head out into other areas, and maybe I'm tired, maybe I'm jaded, maybe I'm old, but I feel like music is not very good at this. I feel like it's really not a very inclusive space. I do some theatre work. I also, again, more delusions of grandeur, do a bit of acting. I work with Grey Eye Theatre Company in London, and I feel like theatre spaces are really inclusive and open. And we're here talking about music, and I hear what you're saying. I mean, is there more to learn from what we're doing here? Does this translate into other sectors? But I wonder, my first thought on that is maybe the inverse is true. Maybe it's music that is the thing that needs to do the learning. I think my personal experience.
Music is guilty of going down this route of sort of this trying to recognise the quality of music by conventional music notation is extraordinarily difficult to learn. Therefore, only very clever people can do it. And there's an elitism around music that is deliberate, and it makes the people that are good at it feel great, but it excludes a large number of people. And it's the same as you could broaden this out as well. I mean, the whole education system is based on how quickly you can do something. So you get a year to do as much of this course as you can. It doesn't judge whether you can achieve that knowledge or not, but if you can do it within a certain time, you get rewarded. Anybody who can't do it within that time is rubbish at it. Now that's kind of and music exists in time, and so a lot of the thing we come up with, again, so part of the jigsaw, one of the massive parts of the jigsaw is that we sometimes we have an idea of how long something is going to take, and then it nearly always takes longer or goes a different route. And the hard thing for us is that we work with funding structures and kind of schedules and other people's kind of programs, and they kind of say, well, how many sessions is it going to take, and when is it going to be ready, and when is the performance going to be, how long is the piece going to be, all of these questions. Actually, I understand why that's the case, but that is one of the barriers, or one of the things that stops it being possible, because somebody with a certain physical condition cannot absolutely say how they are going to be that week. They cannot say what their life is going to be involving, and so Ali and I have talked about with quite a few musicians that we work with is how to capture their performance over a period of time and then edit it together so that they have a chance to share. So it's a filmed or a recorded performance. Is that as good as live is the way? And there's all these things about saying we think that there's a way of doing it, and if music is difficult, it's valued. And that's the thing I would not. The other thing is, hard work is valued. And should it feel hard?
I was kind of thinking about that. We tend to equate betterness of music by its complexity and difficulty, and not by its musicianship. And I think at the core, all musicians are aware of how important something very simple can be, and I tend to use the example that if you have a big orchestral piece and there's just a key moment that involves a single ting on the triangle, well, that absolutely has to be there, and it has to be in the right place. And if you're all waiting for it and it doesn't happen, is that the most complicated thing that anybody's going to play? Well, perhaps not, but is it a hugely important piece of musicianship that somebody puts their thing that they're doing in a really well thought out place? and that's the, what is the value added of moving up in music? Well, it's certainly not about moving from grade 4 to grade 5 to grade 8. It's being present in the musicianship.
Can I just throw in a little provocation about musicianship? This is just a little thing that happened to me, just as an aside for us all to think about, or get angry about. I didn't get angry about this, by the way, but I thought it was interesting. It winds people up, though. A feedback from one of my performances at a conference was, yeah, it's very clever, but he's not a musician. I thought, ooh. Like, my friend who I was working with, he was furious. He was like, how dare they say that about you? And I was like, but it's an interesting problem to solve, isn't it? Like, at what point, especially when you're using new technologies, where is this line that people decide that's music, that's not music, that's technology, that's this? There's all this kind of, there's this Venn diagram, and everyone's got their perfect Venn diagram of like where music lands, and there's probably some difficulty level involved. There's probably a sense of a traditional instrument, certainly as someone who's known for playing a non-traditional instrument. Lots of people love the gloves. Some people really hate what I do, and that's fine. It's exciting to me. It's interesting, but like it doesn't satisfy some people's idea of what music is. We've all got that sort of Venn diagram of what it is, what qualifies. But like you say, that one hit on the triangle might be the thing that makes the piece. You couldn't say that's technically difficult, but it could be technically difficult for some. It's not easy for everybody, is it, to interact with a triangle? There's no one way that we can say this is officially. I mean, I guess there is music that we can all agree is difficult, but like, in terms of what qualifies, I think it's a fascinating problem to turn around in our brains.
It's also just the idea of difficult. What's difficult? What the aesthetics of what does somebody who is sharing in your performance get out of it? And I think I've noticed that with a lot of the work we do, there's two impressions. The audiences can sometimes be moved to tears and wonder at these poor people who have such tragedy in their lives and yet can play beautiful music. And they say, it made me cry. And that is one form of kind of the tragedy, as they call it, sort of disability porn, and this idea of inspiration kind of, and essentially it's almost like, you have made me feel so much better about my life because yours is so terrible. And it's this awful kind of, that there is a bit of that in performances. But also what I think we're aiming for and trying to sort of make happen more often is that people have a sense that person is risking something on stage. They're being very honest and authentic about sort of what they want to portray. There is a chance of it going wrong, but also the balance between the chance of it going wrong and they've kind of got it, even if it does go wrong, there's safety nets and there's preparation and there's experience that will help the music to still go on. And I mean, the best example I can think of is from the gig we did with Chris at the Hidden Door in this June, in a fantastic pianodrome venue, which is a circle of pianos, 100 people all around a violinist and a laptop player. And early on in the 10-minute piece, Chris's leg kind of had a wee spasm and then kicked his butt pad off the stand. And so the bot pad flew up in the air and the audience collectively went, but luckily Ali was kind of nearby, which I guess is part of our safety net thing. Ali was nearby and just kind of
on stage.
He sort of ducked on stage, but Chris caught it with his foot as well, didn't he?
He did.
And so Gordon was playing a long held note, held it a bit longer. Ali kind of put the bot pad back on the stand and then sort of slid back into the audience. And then what I would say is from that moment, that gig was, the audience were like, this is real, this is live. And it's almost like this idea of kind of knowing that things can go wrong helps with this idea of illusion. And this is the challenge, is that somebody who can only move their finger a very small amount, of course they're not going to be able to play some kind of Paganini on the violin. That's not it. But actually for them, an expression of challenge and sort of overcoming something or showing kind of that risk might be something smaller. And I think we should respect the audience's ability to see that and understand it. And that's something that we've been talking about a lot, because we used to describe and explain quite a lot of what we do. We've kind of moved away from it slightly, because we feel that in some ways, if you feel you have to do that, then maybe it's not fair. But anyway, that's a whole other point. And I am aware that it's now 1:30, isn't it?
Yeah.
So,